Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, we are sitting down with translator and also historian Robin Waterfield. Fans of the show will recall we have had Robin on the show before, some of his other translations essential to the Western canon. Today, he has a new book out, Aesop's Fables, a new translation. It's available right now. Link is in the show notes if you would like to check it out. Now, if you're like me, you remember Aesop's Fables from elementary school or lower school or primary school, whatever it was called, wherever you were. They were read to you in second or third grade with some sort of heavy moral that was sometimes expressly stated, sometimes not. And the teacher would use it as a way to sort of explain what you should or should not do. The most famous of which, of course, being the Tortoise and the Hare. Slow, steady wins the race. I can almost hear you all saying it right now, wherever it is that you're sitting. Well, it turns out there's over 700 of these fables, and they've been compiled over a long period of time. And I love this new translation. It would actually be an interesting book to kind of keep handy for those of you who have young children, but don't let them just pick it up because some of these are actually a little racy, honestly. So I thought what we would do today is before we hop into the interview, because this is a totally different kind of book than we normally do on this show. Usually we're looking at some sort of a narrative history in some way, shape, or form. This isn't. This is a pure translation, and it's a translation of what is usually a bunch of shorter texts because the fables are relatively brief. So I thought before we head to the interview, I would read a couple of them that I enjoy and that I thought you might like to hear as well, just so you can kind of get a taste of what's in the book. It's a great book. It clocks in right now at just over 300 pages, over 700 different fables. So it's really great. It'd make a great gift, I think, for someone who's maybe a little bit nostalgic for bygone eras. So let me read a couple of these to you before we hop into the interview. Now, some of these, as I mentioned, they have direct sort of morals. So this one does. I enjoyed it. It's called The Goose and the Stork. A stork came down to her usual pond and found a goose there diving over and over again under the surface of the water. When she asked why, the goose said, "That's what we geese do. We find food in the mud. Oh, it's also how we escape when a hawk attacks us." And the stork said, "Well, I'm stronger than a hawk. Be my friend, and then you'll laugh with scorn at hawks." The goose agreed, and it wasn't long before he asked the stork for protection. He left the pond with her and went into the open countryside, but a hawk swooped down, seized the goose with its talons, and started to eat him up. And the goose cried out against the stork, "Anyone who makes a pact with such a pathetic defender deserves to die a wretched death." The moral being, for those who expect to be defended by people who are unable to guarantee their safety, watch out. Here's another one that has a great moral. This is called The Viper and the Snake. A viper used to go to a certain spring to drink, but the spring was home to a water snake who kept him away from the water. He was angry with the viper for coming to his domain, rather than being satisfied with his own feeding ground. Their quarrel grew ever more bitter until they agreed that they'd fight each other, and that the winner would have the use of the land and the water. Once they had fixed a day for the battle, the frogs, who hated the water snake, came to the viper and boosted his morale by promising to fight alongside him. But when the battle was joined, and the viper was fighting the water snake, the frogs proved incapable of doing anything except croaking loudly. Still, the viper won, and afterward he told the frogs off. They had promised to fight alongside him, but all they did was sing, which was no use to him at all. And the frogs replied, "Learn from this, my friends, that as allies we have only songs to offer, not strength." The point of this tale is that words are useless when physical strength is needed. Now, those of you who remember Aesop's Fables probably remember that a lot of them involve either a wolf or a fox. This one has both, the treacherous fox and the wolf. A wolf had gathered a huge quantity of loot in his den in good time, so that he could enjoy all kinds of delicacies in the coming months. A fox found out about his trove and paid the wolf a visit in his den. "Are you okay?" she whined. "I haven't seen you for ages. I've missed you so much while you've been staying indoors." And the wolf replied caustically, "You're not here because you're worried about me. You're not come out of the kindness of your heart, but to see if I'll give you anything. I know you're trying to trick me." This enraged the fox, and she went to a shepherd and said to him, "What will you give me if today, right now, I turn the enemy of your flock over to you, so that you don't have to worry about him anymore?" "I'll be in your debt," said the shepherd, "and I'll give you whatever you want." So the fox showed the shepherd where the wolf's lair was, and the shepherd immediately killed the wolf with his javelin. Then he let the fox satisfy her envious desire for food that was not her own. Later, when the fox encountered some hunters and was caught by their hounds, as she was being torn to pieces, she said, "Not long ago I committed a major crime. Now I'm dying for having caused someone else's death." Those who harm others should be aware of being harmed by others themselves. Now, not all of the fables actually involve animals, believe it or not. I didn't know that. And so I want to read one to you, one last one that does not. This is Demetrius of Phalerum and Manger, the poet. By an underhanded use of power, Demetrius the Phalarian, as he's called, has gained control of Athens as its sole ruler. The general populace, as is typical of mobs, rushes up to him, pushing and shoving at one another, in a desire to be first to exclaim their congratulations. Even the leading men of the city kiss the hand by which they're oppressed, while inwardly resenting the sad twist of fate that impels them to do so. In fact, even apolitical people and men of leisure come creeping in at the tail end of the crowd, worried in case they fail to do so they'll suffer for it. Among them is Manger, famous for his comedies. Now Demetrius had never met the man himself, although he was familiar with his work and admired his genius. So when the tyrant saw Manger walking in right at the end of the line, with his mincing, foppish gait, anointed with perfume and dressed in flowing robes, he said, "Who is this Nancy who dares to come into my presence swiveling his hips like that?" "That's Manger the writer," said the people standing around him. Demetrius immediately changed his tune. "What a fine-looking man," he said. "It is impossible to imagine that anyone could be more handsome." Ladies and gentlemen, beware compliments sometimes. And now, without further ado, the interview with Robin Waterfield. And welcome back. As I mentioned previously in the introduction, today I am sitting down with Robin Waterfield, who's an eminent translator and historian. And so we're going to talk today about something that, if you've gone to school, you know the word Aesop and Aesop's Fables, because it's something that even in grammar school or in lower school or in elementary school, depending upon where you are, I would wager that we've all read or maybe been read at least one of them at some point in our lives. I know that I've been read several, and until I read this book, I never really thought much about the fables themselves, and I'm going to be honest with everyone listening today, I didn't actually even know where they originated from. But I think one of the places that I want to start with today is just the role of the translator, because you've translated some of the most important texts in the Western world. And so I thought maybe you could explain a little bit about your role and your methods as a translator, and that how you do that when it's a text that it's not just word for word translation. It's also things like author's intent, author's purpose, things like that you have to take into consideration. So if you could talk a little bit about your role, I think that might be illuminating.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on the show again, Adam. But you should be careful what you ask for, because I once gave a 40-minute talk on my translation policy, so I'll keep it short. The way I see it is this: there are two extremes in translating. There are translators who believe that the way to do justice to their author is to follow even his word order and sentence structure as closely as possible. That to me is not translation. Translation is literally the transference of the words and idiosyncrasies of one language into another. You don't retain the idiosyncrasies of the original language when they don't fit. Then the other extreme is the opposite. That is, many translators embellish their texts a bit in order to bring out the nuances they detect, such as you just suggested, the intentions of the author and so on and so forth. I try to find a middle road between those two extremes. I try to write modern, readable English while remaining faithful to the original text. Let me put it this way. Of the two extremes, overly literal translation underestimates the intelligence of the reader. This is particularly common in translations of philosophical texts, and it's true that since ancient philosophers use a lot of precise technical vocabulary, in these cases one has to be just as literal. But Plato, for instance, I've translated a lot of Plato. Plato was a far more fluent writer than most philosophers, and yet still commonly gets translated pedantically and over-literally. Now you can see why I say that this kind of literal translation underestimates the intelligence of the reader. In his early and middle works, Plato rarely felt the need to express his philosophical profundities in pedantic and ugly phrases. He assumed that he could write good Greek and still communicate his point. And over-translation, the opposite, underestimates the intelligence of the original author. Because if the ancient author had wanted the flourishes and so on that so many translators attribute to them, they'd have written them in. Art doesn't have to be obvious. It doesn't have to spell everything out and express every implication and nuance. It leaves such things hovering just below the surface of the text or the painting or whatever. The painting or text then gains depth and resonance. So in fact, in my view, a truer translation is one which leaves in place as much of the resonance as possible without spelling it out. You can see why this might be difficult for philosophers. But please note that I'm talking about translating prose, which is what I chiefly do. Poets who translate ancient Greek poets have to allow themselves much more license than I allow myself. So that's it in short, Adam. I try to achieve a balance between those two extremes, and I do believe that the middle way that I'm trying to walk is the way to be truly faithful to the author I'm translating.
It's interesting because, of course, there's a distinction between translation and interpretation. I think sometimes we see them packaged together in a book, and I find that students can confuse the two, but they're not the same in any way, shape, or form. And I think it's important to bear that in mind as we start to look at any sort of text. And as yesterday we were speaking with on the show an author of biblical history and the problems of translation, because of course throughout history there have been good translations and then there have been less good translations over time. This is a good translation, so that's a positive standpoint for us. But well, let's talk a little bit about the fables for themselves. Like, let's just begin, as Lewis Carroll once wrote at the beginning, and start with, where did the fables originate, and how did they first start to become incorporated into what I suppose we might call the Western canon?
Okay, they didn't reach us by a single route. Originally, the fables were told one by one, so to speak, around the fireside at home, or as a cautionary tale for children, or to entertain others at a symposium. Sometimes politicians would bring up a pertinent fable to help them make a point in a speech. Sometimes playwrights or poets might tell or paraphrase one. So some of the fables we know are found one by one embedded in some such literary context, in a politician's speech or something which happens to have survived, or a poet, or a poem. But later, people began to make collections of the fables. And the first such collection we know of was compiled by a man called Demetrius of Phalerum, a very interesting man in his own right. He studied in the Aristotelian school, and for 10 years he was the sole ruler or dictator of Athens at the end of the 4th century BC. Now, Demetrius's collection hasn't survived, but its point was almost certainly to aid in the training of orators. Teachers of rhetoric liked students to study the fables because they said that it helped them acquire a simple, non-elevated style which would suit some contexts or audiences. Then in the early centuries of this era, CE, further collections were made that have survived in whole or in part. 3 such collections go to make up a set of 350 what are called anonymous fables. Anonymous meaning that the compilers found them one by one in the sources I described a moment ago, or from collections such as Demetrius's. But we also have several collections of fables turned into verse, of which the 2 most extensive are the Latin verse fables written by Phaedrus and the Greek verse fables written by someone called Babrius. More collections were made over the following centuries and into the Middle Ages, but it was only in the middle of the 20th century that they were all pulled together into a single collection by an American scholar called Ben Edwin Perry. His weighty tome contains far more than the fables, contains 2 ancient biographies, 2 ancient lives of Aesop, for instance, but he collected over 700 fables. And that's not counting all the variants. Now, I should explain variants. It's because quite a lot of the fables aren't, as it were, just stories. They're story types. And so they might exist in different versions, with a fox perhaps being the main protagonist rather than a wolf, or a goose rather than a duck, or the variation might be more extensive than that while still retaining the same core story and moral. And if we were to count those as separate fables, there would be way over 700. But Perry collected 700, and that is, as it were, the standard collection now.
That's interesting. I find it a little bit surprising, I suppose, that it took so long, relatively speaking, for all the fables to come together in one particular text. I guess I would have expected maybe at the latest the 18th, 17th century, at some point in there would have been some sort of a collection. So it's interesting that it didn't happen till later than that.
Well, it might have done, but I'm saying not to the fullest extent. And people were writing their own verse fables well into the 17th, 18th century. La Fontaine's fables are particularly famous. And Aesop's fables, were certainly known and read and enjoyed, so there must have been books. But we're also touching on the fact that in recent centuries, I mean, even going back to the 18th century for sure, possibly the 17th, I don't know, you started getting fables. The idea, as you, in a sense, you suggested in your introduction, the idea was that the fables were to be told or read by children, told to or read by children. And you see, in order to do that, first of all, you're not doing a translation because, as we'll soon see, the fables aren't really suitable for children. So they get extremely watered down and simplified in order to be told for children. So they're not translations. And secondly, if this was the main way the fables were being published, a book of fables for children would contain no more than, perhaps 20, 30, 50 fables at the most, something like that. So, that's why I'm giving Perry the credit for actually being the first to pull it all together.
And of course, that's the fun part about history, especially when you get back to the distant past. We don't know exactly. There's certainly a possibility that someone else put it together earlier. We just don't know. It's kind of like a tip of the iceberg scenario. Now this question, I feel like I have to ask, even though it may, again, getting to sort of the distant past idea, that we might not know everything, we might know nothing, but I suppose I want to ask it anyway, which is, who was Aesop to the best of our knowledge?
Well, there almost certainly did exist a person called Aesop, who was famed for his fables. He would have lived in the 6th century BCE. But immediately I have to add that there are fables still in existence that predate his alleged lifetime. So he wasn't the only teller of fables, just a particularly famous one. But after that, having said that much, the details get a bit murky. As I've just mentioned, there are a couple of written in ancient times lives of Aesop, but they are more excuses to retell a few fables and Aesopian jokes in an obviously fictional biographical context. Like most ancient biographies, they are not at all reliable sources of information. But pulling the few more reliable threads together, we get something like this. Aesop was a slave. He was an enslaved person. Born either in Phrygia in Asia Minor, that is Turkey today, or in Thrace, which today would be northern Greece and Bulgaria. He worked as a slave on the Greek island of Samos before he was given his freedom, and he was incredibly ugly. And that really is as much as it were, common law throughout the biographies and other things that we hear about Aesop. That's really all, therefore, that we can safely say, but in my opinion, even that isn't really safe. I think that certainty is impossible because his low status as an enslaved person, his non-Greek ethnicity, and his ugliness made him the perfect vehicle for commenting on aspects of Greek society, which is what the fables do. He was an outsider, casting an amused, cynical and critical eye on the behavior of people around him. So even his enslavement is, in a sense, too good to be true. So as I say, the only really safe thing I think one can say is that he probably did exist. It's the same as the problem with Homer. You know, we don't actually know for sure that there was an ancient poet called Homeros. There almost certainly was. We can't be sure that he's the author of both the poems that have come down to us under his name, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These problems come up time and again when studying ancient texts.
I was going to bring up Homer, and I guess kind of a follow-up question to that is, does it matter? Is it relevant that we don't know particularly who this person is? If we were to discover, I don't know how we would unearth this, but let's just say we did unearth some sort of biography of Aesop or biography of Homer, would it in any way sort of change our perspectives on the fables? I'm not sure.
I'm sure it wouldn't. I mean, but that goes for any work of art or creative work, doesn't it? I mean, we're touching on difficult issues here. Suppose you know so much about an author that you find he's a despicable person. Does that make his work? Does that make you want to not read his work or listen to his music or something? Anyway, sorry, that's probably a digression, Adam. But yeah, no, it wouldn't. Certainly in Aesop's case, it wouldn't make the slightest difference, and it doesn't make the slightest difference because I've just been saying we don't know about him. So what we've got is the fables.
That is an interesting question. I mean, I think that's probably, and I think it's dangerous sometimes for us to put our modern ideals and perspectives onto people from the very distant past, and then cast normative statements about them. But you make a good point that, if we were to discover, some terrible information about Aesop or Homer for that matter, would that make either one of the texts less interesting?
to me, no. I suppose other people may have different responses to that, but at least as far as I'm concerned, I think we could separate those two things. So looking kind of at the fables themselves now, one of the things that certainly I remember as a child hearing the fables is that the protagonists, the characters, are by and large all animals. That was what I remember as setting these out when I remember hearing about them. It is very different from, the fairy tales that I might otherwise hear or be told, where generally the protagonist was a human and you might have animals who play some sort of a supporting role. But this is a little bit different. And so I wanted to ask, are Aesop's fables unique in that the protagonists are animals, in this case non-humans?
No, far from unique. There are fables from around the world, from particularly common in India, which have animals as their protagonists. So the Aesopian fables aren't unique in that sense, but I have to slightly correct you. You said by and large, which was a good hedge, but far from all the Aesopian fables have talking animals as their protagonists. It's certainly true that the most famous ones and the ones that people are most likely to have come across in childhood have animals as the protagonists because, that's their charm and so on. And even in our benighted times, hardly anyone is unfamiliar, at least in outline, with the dog in the manger, for instance, or sour grapes, or the tortoise and the hare. These are the sorts of these fables are so famous that they've given us proverbs, But far from all the fables are animal fables. There are many that have talking inanimate objects, talking trees and bushes, talking parts of the body talking to one another. And there are many in which humans and deities are the protagonists. So what I did in my book, it was arranging the book, was deciding how to arrange the book was not easy. So I just, because as I said earlier, I think the fables were originally told one by one. Should I just scatter the fables, in no order whatsoever? But in the end, what I did was I divided the book into sections, depending on what kind of protagonists are involved. So you get inanimate objects and humans and deities and trees and plants. And then for the majority of the fables, which as you say are animal fables, and then I divide the animal fables according to the different types of animal involved.
And then I guess that gets us into when we're kind of thinking about how this is divided, I think one of the important things we need to think about here is, okay, what is the purpose of a fable, right? Is this intended to be moral in some way, or do fables in general, and then maybe I'll ask the same question about Aesop's fables in particular, do they serve a particular purpose?
Okay, well, I can't talk about fables other than Aesop. I've read some, I know that they exist, I've read a couple of studies, but I'm by no means an expert in anything other than Aesop's fables, and so I'll slide away from that bit. So talking just about Aesop's fables, there is no single purpose. The most famous fables are certainly those that are designed to deliver advice or criticism, with the pill sugared by the lightheartedness of the story that acts as the vehicle. But quite a lot of fables are no more than jokes, with a punchline, you would say, rather than with a lesson. Quite a few are merely entertaining or paradoxical stories designed to raise an amused or ironic smile, and perhaps with little or no generalized truth to tell. Many fables are ideological. They explain the origin of something. And many are agonal. There are other categories I'm sliding over because they're rarer, but many are agonal, pitting rivals against each other, like famously the tortoise and the hare. And some simply retail animal lore. Now, Adam, if we've got time, shall I give a few examples of a couple of those types?
I think the examples would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, right. Well, here's one that's just an amusing story, for instance. I'm starting to quote now. A square-cut statue of Hermes had been placed by the side of a road, supported by a pile of stones at its base. A dog came up and said, "To begin with, Hermes, I salute you, but then I'd like to anoint you. I can't walk past a deity without doing so, and especially you, the god of wrestling." And the statue said, "I'll thank you not to come and lick off the oil with which I'm already coated, and not to piss on me either. That's all the honour I need from you." See? Just an amusing story. Or here's an ideological one. The creature that we now call Ant was originally human. He worked as a farmer, but the fruits of his own labour weren't enough for him, and he used to cast envious eyes on his neighbours' farms and steal their crops. His greed made Zeus angry, and he changed the man into the creature we call Ant. But although his form changed, his character didn't. Even now he goes around the fields gathering grains of wheat and barley that belong to others and storing them up for himself. So there are quite a few that do that kind of thing, explain, in this case, the origin of ants, but the origin of something or other. It could, but not necessarily an animal or a creature, but it could be the origin of why life is hard, for instance. There's another one. Now here's an agonal one, pitting rivals against each other. The North Wind and the Sun were arguing about which of... This is a famous one. The North Wind and the Sun were arguing about which of them was stronger, and they decided that the victor would be whichever of them could get a certain wayfarer to undress. The North Wind went first and blew a mighty blast, but the man clung onto his clothes, so he blew even more forcefully. Increasingly troubled by the cold, the wayfarer kept adding more layers of clothing, and eventually the North Wind gave up and let the Sun have a go. First, the sun shone quite gently, but once the man had taken off his extra layers, he turned up the heat. Finally, the man could no longer stand it, and he stripped and went off to bathe in a nearby river. And finally, here's a piece of animal lore. The beaver is a 4-footed, pond-dwelling creature. It's said that his testicles supply effective remedies for a number of ailments, and so whenever one is spotted, he's hunted down. But the beaver knows perfectly well why he's being pursued. For a while, he tries to escape simply by running as fast as he can. After all, he wants to keep himself whole. But when he sees that his capture is inevitable, he bites off his own testicles and abandons them, thus saving his life. So, right, not only the ones that have a moral at the end, that are supposed to supply advice or something, there's all sorts of different fables.
And I think as a child growing up, I recall basically only hearing those that did supply morals. I think by and large those were the only ones that we got, and maybe that was simply because that was what wound up in the textbook. But that certainly.
It is. It's, like I said before, it's because it was usually assumed that fables were a good thing for children, and so they, had this a little moral at the end as a way of educating children.
Well, we certainly weren't told the one about the beaver and his testicles. That was not one that was reiterated to the third grade. I can tell you that much. Well, that's interesting. So that like a lot of them was just things that it's what gets included in the various anthologies and in the different compilations of texts throughout time, because it's rare, other than in your translation, to see so many of them together. That's just not something that I think that most people normally get, which is unfortunate, but that's also just kind of the way that it is. I was wondering a little bit about, could you explain a little bit about the structure of the fables? They seem obviously very short, to the point. I didn't know if there was some variation between the structures, if that lined up to the purpose behind the fable in some way, shape, or form, or if they were all more of a uniform structure.
Well, actually, quite a lot of the fables in Perry's collection, for instance, are quite long and rambling, but I believe that these were all written later. They were, embellishments of an original short core, and so I believe that the original fables were short, as you just said. And I also think they had a very clear tripartite structure, clearer in the shorter fables than in the slightly longer ones. Sometimes the shorter fables consist of just 3 sentences, each sentence giving a part of that structure. So what they do is they start by giving the bare minimum of background information needed to enable the reader or listener to creatively imagine the scene, let's say. And after this introduction of the scene and the protagonist of the fable comes the action of the story, and then finally a closing comment, which usually carries the moral or lesson of the story. So, here's one. A dog who had proved his speed and strength against all kinds of wild animals and who had always pleased his master began to lose his energy under the burden of old age. Okay, sentence 1 gives us the background information. Then we get the action of the story. One day, he found himself up against a bristle-backed boar and he seized the beast by the ear. But with his rotten teeth, he couldn't maintain his grip and the boar got away. Okay, second sentence. And now, what about the moral? The hunter lost his temper and scolded the dog, but the old warrior replied, "It wasn't my spirit that let you down, but my strength. If you see fit to condemn me for the way I am, you should praise me for what I was." Okay? So I believe that, as I say, to be the original structure. Which, as I say, got somewhat lost when people were just sort of telling the fables as stories in their own right, not necessarily. Because, I mean, in order to deliver a moral or a lesson, they've got to be short and punchy. And I also believe that the original fables are like the one I just read out. That is, that the moral is embedded in the story, as it was in the last sentence of that bit. It wasn't my spirit that laid. If you see fit to condemn me for the way I am, you should praise me for what I was. Spoken by the dog, who is himself the protagonist of the story. But quite often what you get is, as I say, I think in later ages, people started adding morals onto the story. Sometimes the moral, which in my translation I've translated in italics to show that it's separate from the story itself, from the fable itself. Sometimes this italicized moral just repeats the moral that's contained in the story already. Sometimes it adds something on. Sometimes its interpretation of the story is really quite weird, so that you get morals appended to fables which you have to struggle to see their relevance and things like that. But the one I just quoted, I believe, preserves the original structure with the tripartite structure with the moral contained within the story itself.
Well, I think I would be remiss then if I didn't ask if you had a personal favorite fable or something that you really would like to share with everyone. Because, I mean, I read them and I enjoy them all, but I obviously didn't spend nearly as much time translating them, so I didn't know if there was one that you just particularly enjoyed. Maybe you enjoyed the translation work of that one, but I think it'd be worth us knowing about.
An elderly woman had a problem with her eyes, so she asked a doctor to call on her and agreed to pay him his fee. The doctor made repeated visits to her house, and each time, after he'd put ointment on her eyes and gummed up her eyelids, he made off with something of hers. Once she was cured, by which time he'd cleared the house out, he asked to be paid the stipulated fee, and when she refused, he took her before the authorities. But she argued that she'd promised to pay him if he cured her eyes, whereas his treatment had made things worse than before. "I used to be able to see all the things I had in my house," she said, "but now I can't see a single one of them."
That's amusing. I didn't see it going that way until the very end.
And that one has one of these appended morals as well. It says, "Likewise, dishonest people fail to realize that their greed causes them to convict themselves."